Hi, this is Listen and Be Heard radio for readers and writers. We interview a lot of poets on our program. There have been some poets across the country that have been, who have just become poet laureates. For instance, Jenny Lim in San Francisco was just nominated or just received, that position. And today, no less, we have another poet laureate, happens to be the poet laureate of the state of Iowa. And I'm going to read from his biography that's in his new book. Vince Gotera is the current poet laureate of Iowa. And he recently retired as an English professor at the University of Northern Iowa, where he was a professor there for many years. He was also editor of the North American Review, which is the longest lived literary journal in the country from 2000 to 2016, and also of Starline, the print journal of the International Science Fiction and Fantasy Poetry Association. Did that for a few years. He's published, widely, over 300 poems, and is the author of 4 previous poetry collections, including Dragonfly, Ghost Wars, Fighting Kite, and The Coolest Month. Vince Gotera, welcome to Listen and Be Heard. Dragons and Ray Guns, it's your latest collection of poetry. Tell us something about the book.
Sure. This is a book of speculative poetry, which is science fiction, fantasy, and horror. There are different definitions of what speculative poetry is, and I'm using there the Science Fiction and Fantasy Poetry Association, the SFPA, the SFPA's definition, and the title "Dragons and Ray Guns" is supposed to represent, those different genres. And my son Marty Gotera did the cover, and I asked him to include a dragon and a ray gun on the cover.
Right, right.
And also make it look like a comic book. And so he really did the job.
Marty, his name is Marty.
Marty, yeah.
A wonderful job. I noticed that it has this comic book vibe, which made me think, Walter Mosley often speaks about comic books. When people ask him, well, when you started off, you were reading Albert Camus and blah, blah, blah. And he said, no, 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 it was the Fantastic Four. And that the way he puts it is that he kind of entered the life of fiction through the comics being the vehicle that told him what life was about when he was 6 and 7 years old. Was that the same with you?
I think so, probably. I do remember being about 9 or 10, maybe, and discovering Marvel. As opposed to DC. I read DC for a long time.
Yes.
And in fact, I had the first the first issue that Thor was in, and I was just a little kid, and it wasn't even his own comic. He was like a guest in another comic. He was a crippled doctor, and he had somehow, I still remember very vividly reading this comic book that he had been somehow trapped in a cave, and he got mad, and he had a cane, and he hit the floor of the cave with the cane, and it turned out that the cane was actually the hammer Mjolnir, and so it got changed into Thor right at that second.
Right.
Kind of a silly thing, but yeah, I really loved comic books as a kid. And when I went away to college, my mom got rid of all the comic books.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Isn't that
I can
awful?
relate because I had a collection and my stepmother did the same thing. I remember Thor, one of the lines in one of the comics was with hammer in hand, Thor will fight, right? But the other thing too that that I was told because I had friends that were from Brooklyn, from Flatbush, said that a lot of the guys that were writing writing for them, were Jewish guys from Brooklyn. And when you read the text, you read the dialogues and everything, they were talking like Jewish guys from Brooklyn, right? Like Thor would, say something, it would kind of like, it would be, maybe something that incorporated a little Yiddish. Or is there one like superhero from Marvel or from the comics that you especially identified with? And the reason I bring it up is because you have this cover, and I could just tell that that comics must have played a big role.
Yeah, I really like Doctor Strange,
Mm.
and I'm not really sure why. I think it was because he got to go to really cool looking places, the interdimensional locations, and I do remember that. And I, of course, also sided with the warrior Hogan, who was Thor's Asian uh, homie, and that it didn't seem weird to me at the time, but it does seem kind of strange now. Here's this guy in Asgard who's Asian, right?
Yeah,
So,
yeah. Yeah, seeing that at that time as well, I guess we were talking about the early 60s, around that time period. Well, speaking of Asian and Asian characters, now you were born in San Francisco. You spent a little time in the Philippines. Just tell us about that experience and how it perhaps got you to, begin writing poetry.
well, I was, as you said, I was born in San Francisco and raised there for the most part, except for a few years when I was little in the Philippines when my parents moved back for a while. Um, and I do remember that my very first poem, I think I might have been six, maybe, or five, something like that, six probably. I was in kindergarten, I think, at the time, and or maybe first grade. And anyway, I was on a ferry boat with my dad, and I remember that seeing the sun up in the sky and wondering about it, and I was pretty well read, as a kid. I remember reading, for example, Arabian Nights. I was probably like four. My dad taught me to read when I was two,
Hmm.
and so yeah, so I knew a little bit about the sun, and I remember I came home and wrote this poem that was in alternating quatrains, A B A B. So I uh, I wrote this poem about the sun, and I remember a little bit about it, that talking about how it was made from gas and all of this kind of thing. And anyway, my mom sent it to the school, and so that was my first taste of publication, also, because
Wow.
they put it in the school newsletter.
Wow. Well, in one of your poems, you do use a word that I thought was very interesting, deliquescent. And
Yes.
I looked it up, and it has something to do with being liquid and gaseous and being able to kind of move. And in your writing, just as you illustrated, being on a ferry, how that can facilitate creativity. I remember one of the first things that I had read that you had written was about being on a streetcar. I think it was the N Judah streetcar in San Francisco, and how movement, uh, can movement in landscape and in place can, you know, facilitate or inspire your work. Did you have any like literary heroes? I mean, you started reading at an early age. Were there any literary heroes or perhaps non-literary heroes that perhaps influenced your writing?
One of my literary heroes was Dylan Thomas. And, I don't really know why. I was probably in high school at the time. And I just thought that his work was so powerful. And it is. I don't think he has very good reputation these days, but he was, at that time in the early 70s probably. was a big name, and he had been a big name because he was quite a reader. And I mean, reading aloud. He was a very dramatic presence, and and I don't know that I had heard that, or maybe, and I don't really remember exactly how I knew about. Well, no, I knew about Dylan Thomas at first through high school, but I don't remember if I ever heard him read. It's possible that one of my high school English teachers might have played a record of his. And anyway, he really inspired me, and I wrote a lot. I remember in freshman year of high school, I was in my first poetry class, and I wrote a poem that was sort of reminiscent of his work. Um, Otherwise, I read a lot, and I don't know that I read a lot of of poetry at that time. I did read a lot of science fiction.
Mm.
I discovered science fiction in fifth grade. Um, the I went to St. Agnes uh, school in San Francisco. You might remember that school
Yeah.
on Ashbury,
Hmm.
right up the street from the corner of Haight Ashbury, and so we had all the boys in our class for some odd reason. This would have been about 1965, maybe, and we all started. We were like a book club. Very odd for 10-year-old boys to create a book club, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And we started reading uh, the Oz books, and we read all the Oz books in a row. We would actually read them and get together and talk about them. And it seems odd to me now to think that there we were. I mean, we're talking all the boys in the class. The athletes, the nerds, the brains. We were all doing this, and then we ran out of Oz books, and then we moved to the borrowers. And I'm wondering now if maybe that was because the girls in the class and uh, got us to start reading Mary Norton borrower books, and then we ran out of those. And so I was searching around in the school library one day, and I discovered this writer Andre Norton, next to Mary Norton, and I didn't know that she was one of the most prolific and very popular science fiction novelists and short story writers, of that time. And then that got me hooked. And I still remember the first book, the first science fiction book I read, which was Star Rangers by Andre Norton. I can still see the title, I can still see the cover in my mind's eye. And that got me, that really led directly to where I am now, reading all of that science fiction. I remember I started going to the library and reading, all the classics of science fiction.
So I guess, with science fiction being, this well of imagination and worlds and, time and time shifts and things like that, that um, I guess a sense of place is really important, crafting a world. Uh, are there any different challenges, let's say, in crafting a speculative poem as it would, a non-speculative type of poem?
Sure. Sometimes I will borrow, from an existing universe. For example, the first book I'm sorry, the first poem in the book is called Time Lord Thief, and that I'm borrowing there from Doctor Who. Doctor Who is a Time Lord, and this is not the character is not Doctor Who himself or herself, I guess, but actually um, one of Doctor Who's peers. I'm guessing, so I made that up, and that poem actually is also um, in a poetic form that I invented back in the 70s, back in the late 70s. I was in college at the time at San Francisco State, and I had made up this form just because I was tired of using, all the standard forms. And so this was a poem, a form rather, that I haven't come up with a good name for. It's a terza rima haiku sonnet. So each of the stanzas is a haiku, that's strict 575.
Mhm.
Haiku in shape only, not in essence. And then it's rhymed in terza rima, which is the rhyme scheme that Dante used, and then made up as a sonnet. And so, well, of course, if you have 3-line stanzas, you'd end up with 15. So I squished the last stanza um, into a couplet instead of a tercet.
So the so that's the are you referring to the first poem in the book, Time
Yes,
for a
yes.
Thief? Yeah, that was
Yep.
an interesting yeah, that was in terms of form, in terms of content, very interesting, but also very playful at the same
Yes,
time. You
yes,
know, a good intro to, this landscape
right.
that you're crafting.
Well, this is, you know what, Tony, this is my main message as Poet Laureate of Iowa, is that poetry can be fun. I mean, that's basically it. I think a lot of poets and a lot of readers of poetry think that poetry should be so serious all the time, and about really life-changing, world-changing topics, and of course that is true, right? But at the same time, I think we can have fun. We should have fun with poetry.
Yeah, because with these poems, if the few that I've written, that I've read in the book, um, it's almost like you have the polarity of childhood and adulthood, and there's this pull where the child part is as mature perhaps as the adult, in all in a speculative kind of way. Now, in terms of your own career, in terms of your own writing, I know that you occupy, um, different personas. You're a musician, a father, um, of course, a teacher, poet laureate, a veteran, a San Franciscan, and also a poet. Not to mention a Filipino American. Um, how does all those things come into play? It's like I guess it's like the Filipino dessert they call halo halo. It's kind of a mixture. How does that all of that lend to your uniqueness?
Well, I don't think about it very much. I just write what I write. I know that seems silly, but I I find that I find myself turning from topic to topic. Sometimes I'm writing about music, sometimes I'm writing about place. I've written a number of poems about San Francisco, for example. Um, Sometimes I write about race and about race relations. I write about being Filipino and so on. So, for example, in this book, I have 4 poems that deal with Philippine myth.
Yes.
2 of them are about aswang, who are a mythical Filipino monster, and then 2 of them are about Bakunawa, who is the Philippine dragon that used to eat the moon. And so can I read one of those for you?
Yes, please.
Let's
Please.
see. Um,
This is Bokanawa, the sea dragon eats the
yeah,
fifth. Okay.
okay. Um, Bakunawa, the sea dragon, desires the 7 moons in high heaven. Um, just as background, in Philippine myth, there used to be 7 moons, and uh, and we only have 1 moon now because Bakunawa ate 6 of them,
Mm.
and
Yeah.
so he would just jump out of the ocean, and he was a sea dragon. He would just jump out of the ocean and eat them, and eventually the Filipinos figured out how to stop him from eating the moon, and so that's why we still have 1 moon left in the sky. Okay. Something too about this poem, something that I often do in my work is I try to imagine what it's like to be to be someone else, to be, in this case, to be Bakunawa the dragon. What does that feel like? And what are the desires of such a creature? Okay, Bakunawa the sea dragon desires the 7 moons in high heaven. I look around my kingdom, blue and black and glorious. Water flows through all my doors, while my eyes pierce the darkness. Schools of fish swirl like spirals of glinting light in the distance. I often swim up to the surface of the water and point my snout towards the heavens. Up there in the firmament, I glimpse against the sea of bright points of light the faraway stars, 7 spheres gleaming in the night. Every time I do this, the number of spheres differs, sometimes just 2 or 3, other times 6 or 7. These moons glimmer in different shapes, from curving slivers to crescents full of roundness. I hunger for them. Below the surface, I feast on whales and massive clouds of shrimp, but there is nothing like the 7 spheres in my domain. During the day, there is the glory of the one sun when it rules the sky. The sun is too hot to eat, but when the sky is gone, I'm sorry, but when the sun is gone away each night, the 7 moons shed their delicious light, and I want to eat them. I will launch myself into the star-riddled sky, eat all 7 moons.
Oh, wow, wow. And that's Bakunawa, the sea dragon. That is a myth about the moon in the Philippines. The
Well, no,
Philippines
about a dragon.
about a dragon who eats the moons, right?
Yes, right. So I think it's probably the explanation, that our ancestors had for why there were lunar eclipses.
Mm.
Yeah, and
Uh,
I was
well,
just going to say this is a poem in a form called haibun, which is a Japanese form that consists of a prose paragraph coupled with a haiku.
so at the end we have the haiku,
Yes,
and this is what do you say? What's the form? It's Japanese form, you said?
haibun,
Haibun.
haibun, which is a combination of prose and haiku.
Oh, this is really wonderful. I was kind of taken and drawn to the presence of dragons in the book because I happen to be born in the year of the dragon, and
Oh, me too.
no kidding. So
Yeah,
a part of it is stoicism, right? On the part of the dragon, and just these different things. It just seems like a very strong kind of sign, at least in the Chinese, the Chinese, I guess, astrological um,
right.
plethora of signs. Um, One other thing, because we're going to have to wrap up in a bit, but I know you're also a musician. I've seen you post various things on social media. Now you play, is it the bass or is it the guitar?
Both. I've played guitar for over 60 years and bass for about 40. And I'm
Okay.
in a band. I'm actually in 2 bands. One I'm a bass player, the other one I'm a guitarist.
Wow. So I guess that that flows well. There's no conflict between because I'm not being a musician myself, but it made me think. The late Al Young. He said something really powerful. He said that music should be joined cheek to jowl with poetry, and that the farther, and this is what Al said. He said the farther away music gets from poetry, the weaker it gets. But I wanted to know is how your music informs, because you have a poem in here about Jimi Hendrix, right?
Yes.
And maybe who are a couple of your musical heroes, and how does your musicianship impact your literary work?
That's an interesting question. No one's ever asked me before. I think that they feel like different spheres to me. Um, I guess the connection really is rhythm. That we have, of course, rhythm in poetry, and rhythm is inescapable in music, and those are probably two of the overlaps, or one of the overlaps between the two endeavors. Um, I've I've had people ask me if I write music as well, and I don't. I guess I think of the lyrics in music as being different from the lyrics from the lyricism that you find in poetry.
Mm,
Um, in poetry, the music is contained in the words, right? And in music, they're really two separate things. And in many ways, you can't have for with music, you can't have. I mean, with maybe the exception of Bob Dylan, we usually don't think of the lyrics as being poems in themselves.
mm.
And so I don't know where I'm going with this, Tony, but but they seem very separate to me.
Well, one of the interesting things that I didn't know was, because I listen to a great deal of music, but the song "Moonlight in Vermont" is actually haiku. All
Oh,
of the like pennies in a stream, falling leaves, a sycamore, moonlight in Vermont. All those stanzas, all those lyrics were based on the 575, and I was listening, and I'm like, yeah, that's right. I was listening to Sinatra sing it, right? And I'm like, wait a minute, that is haiku, right? And the reason I kind of got into it because I went to school in Vermont, right? And that's the state song. And I just started doing research about it. I'm like, wow, it's a haiku, right? Um, Again, this is Listen and Be Heard Radio for readers and writers. We have Vince Gotera with us. Vince Gotera, the author of Dragons and Ray Guns by Final Thursday Press. He was recently appointed the Poet Laureate of Iowa. Much congratulations and much good wishes and success to you on that, Vince. Finally, I wanted to ask, since you'd been a teacher for so long in the Iowa, I guess it was the Iowa program, which, is a pretty, prestigious program in,
actually, not the Iowa program. They're down the
they're,
road.
they're down
Yeah.
the road. But, having been a professor in creative writing, invariably, people will ask, younger writers will say, well, God, do I really need one? Do I really need an MFA? What would you say to somebody who's, younger, maybe, pondering?
Well, the thing about the MFA is that it can save you a lot of time and effort. It is possible, obviously, to become a great writer without getting an MFA. But the advantage of the MFA program is that it brings together people who are searching to become writers. And so in an MFA program, you're in a community of like-minded people, and that helps to develop your own work, especially because you will see, in the workshop, you'll see that the things that you're working on are often the same thing that others are working on, and you can see how they are solving those problems, and you can apply that to your own work. And
Mm.
so, yeah, that's the advantage, I think, of the MFA is the community.
Oh, that's fantastic, and that's some really excellent advice. Because having come from the MFA program um, myself, it was very tiring. I was in there for 2 years. It was one of those distance programs, and it was very tiring. I'm still tired, but I'm still making time to do these do these interviews. One last question. You're a also a musician. You've been playing for over 50 years. You're a bassist and a guitarist. Um, if you had to assemble a Vince Gotera all-star band, you can pick anybody, vocalist, whatever, right? Who's in your band? Who's in the all-star band?
Well, um, I, I think I would modify the answer by talking not about people I would play with necessarily, but people that I would like to see play together.
Mhm.
And I would love to see Carlos Santana play with Victor Wooten. Um, just because they're both so inventive and so creative, in the way that they approach music. I'd love to see that uh, come together. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. Well, I could go on and on about music. There's a guy that has this platform on YouTube. I don't know if you ever saw him, a guy named Rick Beato.
sure,
He was talking about how why this was really interesting. This came out within the last couple of weeks. He did a thing on why people don't appreciate music, why it's not valued anymore, right? And he says it's because of the streaming platforms. He says that for like $10 a month, you can have access to all the music that's ever been recorded. And he says that when he was younger, there was a sweat equity investment. You had to go out and work your job at Burger King, and then you'd save your money. You'd have to drive to a record store. You would put it on you'd put the vinyl on the plate. Then you'd bring it to your friends, and you'd all listen to it. And then you'd read the liner notes. Just very 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 interesting uh, take um, take on that. Again, this is Listen and Be Heard radio for readers and writers. Our guest has been Vince Gotera. And before we wrap up, Vince, congratulations again on being appointed Poet Laureate of Iowa. If you can maybe just share maybe three things that in your tenure, three things that you are going to focus on in being Poet Laureate.
sure. I have been going around giving talks lately, just to folk that don't have poetry in their everyday lives. And for example, I recently gave a talk at a Rotary Club, and and I talked about poetry in business. And then a couple of weeks before that, I talked at a um, at a Presbyterian church in Cedar Rapids, and there I talked about poetry and religion. And so I think that one of the things that I hope to do is to show people that poetry is something that can touch their lives. That poetry is something that can help them to see the world in different and perhaps more interesting ways, and see also their own everyday lives in interesting different ways.
Mm,
Um, and then I
absolutely.
mentioned earlier that one of my messages is that poetry can be fun, and I have been trying to show that in the different readings and and talks I've been doing. And then the third thing probably is that I hope to bring the joy of writing poetry to people. Um, I haven't had the opportunity yet. I've only been poet laureate for a couple of months here, well, since March
Mm,
of this. What was it, May? One of the M months. But anyway, I hope to be able to give workshops in the writing of poetry,
mm,
and
that's good. Yeah.
that will come, I'm sure. But mostly to just let people know that I remember not that long ago somebody said to me that poetry was a dead art, and I thought, well, at first I thought, well, come on, dude, I'm standing right in front of you, right? And so,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
but at the same time, I think that a lot that people think of poetry as something that was done by ancient people, and of course, ancient these days is like 20 years ago, right? But
Yeah.
anyway, and I hope to show people that yeah, you can write poetry too, and that poetry is is what you make of it, and not necessarily some poem by Shakespeare.
Yes, yes. Again, this is Vince Gotera, the author of the new collection of poems called Dragons and Ray Guns, um, published by Final Thursday Press. You can catch Vince online um, on his blog, and his blog is called The Man with the Blue Guitar. If you want to get into the blog and learn about what he's doing and some of the readings and some of the events that are upcoming, Vince Gotera, and that's spelled Gotera, vincegotera.blogspot.com. Once again, Dragons and Ray Guns, poems by Vince Gotera, published by Final Thursday Press. A lot of good stuff in here. Can prove that poetry can be both poignant and fun, and you can learn a lot in this as well. There's scientific things to learn about this, and it can lead you into different directions. Once again, Vince, thank you so much for being with us here at Listen and Be Heard Radio for readers and writers. And once again, as we always do, we're going to toss it back to Martha in the studio.
Thanks, Tony.